II, on the 31st of October 2000, proclaimed St. Thomas More patron of statesmen and politicians. There are many reasons for proclaiming Thomas More patron of statesmen and people in public life. Among these is the need felt by the world of politics and public administration for credible role models able to indicate the path of truth at a time in history when difficult challenges and crucial responsibilities are increasing. In this context, it is helpful to turn to the example of St. Thomas More, who distinguished himself by his constant fidelity to legitimate authority and institutions precisely in his intention to serve not power, but the supreme ideal of justice. His life teaches us that government is above all an exercise of virtue. Unwavering in this rigorous moral stance, this English statesman placed his own public activity at the service of the person, especially if that person was weak or poor. He dealt with social controversies with a superb sense of fairness. He was vigorously committed to favouring and defending the family. He supported the all-round education of the young. His profound detachment from honours and wealth, his serene and joyful humility, his balanced knowledge of human nature and of the vanity of success, his certainty of judgment rooted in faith, these all gave him that confident inner strength that sustained him in adversity and in the face of death. His sanctity shone forth in his martyrdom, but it had been prepared by an entire life of work devoted to God and to neighbour.
Thanks, Monica, for those words. Just before we start, if you ladies at the back, would you like to come down? You can take a seat down here if you like. Okay, all right, that's fine. So we'll now move on to the introduction of Senator Dodson, and tonight Zara Mason, who's the mission captain of Durham Island College, Missionaries of the Sacred Heart College. Zara will introduce Senator Patrick Dodson. Zara.
When the invitations are emailed to all of you on the St. Thomas More Forum database, they reach the network spreads far and wide. After the St. Thomas More Parish announced this forum with Senator Dodson, we received the following message from Mark Dempsey, who is in our database. Mark lives in Sydney and is the son of the late Boyd and the late Gwen Dempsey, who are great members of the St. Thomas More Parish. Mark, along with his brother Bede and other members of the family, attended Durham Island College. The parish dedicated the first book of speeches to the St. Thomas More Forum to Boyd Dempsey, who was a great parishioner and supporter of the forum for many years. Mark wrote, "I am so pleased to be on the St. Thomas More Forum mailing list and often wish I could make it. It is an important contribution to our social debate. I met Senator Dodson at Durham Island College at MSc School in about 1970. The Senator was then a member of the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart a year or two before his ordination. At the time he caught me misbehaving and could only express his astonishment that I was my older brother's brother. You're not Bede Dempsey's brother," he said with disbelief. Senator Dodson is such an impressive figure. His contribution to our national discussion and understanding has been extraordinary. The dignity and understanding he shows, even for others people's lack of understanding, is itself a great moral lesson for others. Please convey my apologies to the St. Thomas More Forum organisers and Senator Dodson. He is an extraordinary man and a great spokesperson for the first and all Australians. I am very sorry that we will be away and unable to attend. Mark Dempsey, Senior Counsel, is a former student of Darramallin College and is one of Australia's leading baristas in the areas of major construction litigation and international arbitration. Senator Patrick Dodson was appointed by the Parliament of Western Australia on the 24th of March 2016 and was elected to the Senate in 2016. Senator Dodson was ordained a Catholic priest as a member of the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart in 1975. He has held many significant positions, including as a Royal Commissioner into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1989 and Chair of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation from 1991 to 1997. He is a former Director of the Central Land Council and the Kimberly Land Council and former member of the Council of the Australian National University. Most recently, Senator Dodson was the co-chair of the expert panel of constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians, which reported in 2012. He is now the co-chair of the Joint Select Committee of the Constitutional Recognition relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people. He is now the Shadow Assistant Minister of the Indigenous Affairs and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Senator Dodson will speak tonight on changing the national agenda for First Nations and the role people of faith can play.
The praise that others heap on you is terribly humbling. I want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose lands we gather and upon whom, on many occasions, they welcome us to these lands, particularly in Matilda House as well. But they've done a great service to this nation by the work that they do to help educate many people to the significance of the First Nations peoples. I'm come straight from the budget, so my head, and I wasn't very pleased about the budget in relation to First Nations peoples, and probably contrary to what people might think of my placid nature, I was a bit upset about the lack of resourcing to the Indigenous First Nations peoples in the closing the gap struggle, into remote housing, and into the need for a radical reform to what's called a Work for the Dole scheme of the CDP and other things. So the lack of vision primarily in that, which is, I don't pretend I'm going to be able to deliver a vision for you tonight as to how we might change the world, except to ask you to vote Labor, of course, at the next election. But I've been asked to speak on changing the national agenda for First Nations and the role people of faith can play. And of course that throws up the challenges, as we heard, about a world where racism and assimilationist views are on the rise, and where different faiths are being demonised, and we need to remind ourselves that we hold more in common as human beings than what divides us. And one of the lessons I learned from the reconciliation days from the late Rick Farley was the real effort for us, with our diversity, differences and prejudices, to try and find the common ground amongst us. And as human beings, there is that commonality. We are diverse and different, and we have all sorts of other consequences of the cultures and societies that we come out of, but basically we are in a common position. We're part of a complex creation, and we share this one planet, despite whatever differences, prejudices and other things we have. So there's some imperatives for us to find common ground amongst ourselves over very complex and difficult issues. I understand that. But not only over the complex issues, but over far more simpler ones. And we need to search for the principles that can unite people of faith, the diversity of faith, not just the ones that we have affiliations with, the Abrahamic traditions of Christianity and Judaism and Islam, but also with other faiths from other traditions. And so part of my challenge was trying to get my head around some of this as to be of some use in what I've got to say tonight. And so the first thing I did was turn to my friend and a brilliant writer in his own achievements and a humanist in Raymond Gator, and his concept of a common humanity. And he writes, "To recognise the humanity of others, we must rise to the humanity in ourselves. But to do that, we must at least be open to seeing fully the humanity of all people. In a similar way, the acknowledgement of human rights, rights that all peoples are said to possess merely by virtue of being human, appears to be interdependent with the acknowledgement of a common humanity with them. The same is true for the recognition of the dignity of humanity, to which we are told in principle, to preambles to important instruments of international law, and unconditional respect is owed as to its existence, alienability in every human being." So grappling with diversity in faith and the commonality of humanity is something we've not been really good at as humans, I think. We tend to gravitate towards those we can immediately find affinity with and have some sense of common tradition, narrative or experience. The United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Council in 1948, stated in its preamble that the recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. And of course words they've got to have meaning by humans. Humans have got to give words meaning through action, through their commitments, through their courage, through their insights, and through their unique ways of interpreting words that talk about freedom, justice and peace in the world. If I may, I might just talk a little bit about the Yawuru people that I come from, because some of these concepts resonate within some of the principles or guiding values that Yawuru people have. And Yawuru people are from around the Broome area of Western Australia and have been subject to a whole range of influences over a long period of time by the church and governments and pastoralists and pearlers and Asian people who were brought as indentured labourers. So the human cosmos was a very rich place in its early period. But the Yawuru talk about a thing called Mabu Lian, and they talk about a thing called Mabu Buru, and they talk about another matter called Mabu Ngarangu. And Mabu Lian is really what's the state of my being? How do I feel at the very essence of whom it is I am? And this is about more than individual well-being, as it's more of a metaphysical concept than it is about a measure of well-being. So I'm not going to go any further into the complexities of it, but it really is a notion, a guiding principle of people's behaviour and a guidance to their ethical and moral behaviours and their social responses as well. And that links to the other concept of Mabuburu, which is about the well-being of the country. It's about keeping the country healthy, keeping it rich in its diversity and uniqueness, and keeping the stories of the country strong. Because this is about connectivity, about how the physical attributes of the country speak to my being as an individual, but my family and my community. And Mabungarangu is about how we are as a collective. How are we functioning as an entire community in the face of all the dynamics that interact or impose themselves upon us, or that we hear about and that we witness? And what really is the state of our being as a collective group that identifies as the Yawuru people? And this, as I say, relates to the quality of our health and our being in relationship with others, other human beings, not only of our own community, but others outside of that community, and obviously our connectivity to the broader environment and ultimately the world and the dynamics that interact with the world and cause either joy or sorrow or sadness to many of us. These are not unique concepts. I'm sure there are other ways to articulate these matters that others have got. And so who I am as a human being and the health of my country and the health of my community are interconnected. So if we're wanting to rebuild an agenda for First Nations peoples, we've got to understand first something about those concepts. How do they feel? How are they experiencing the collectivity of our world? And how are they treated in relation to their connectivity to land? And how do we then, by converse, apply the same formula or the same sort of matrix to whom we are as individuals within our own systems of belief and faith, and therefore then in our relationships to others of difference and diversity. Your traditions of faith may come from great teachers or prophets, or from complex philosophical teachings and ideas, and from contemplations. So I'm trying to think of the complexity of the world. Recently I went to Vietnam and we've never been there before, and stood in the shadow of Ho Chi Minh and witnessed the ways in which that group of people celebrate their existence or their existences, and wondered why we ever went to war with them. But the richness of that connectivity of those people, seeing graves in the paddy fields of people ploughing to grow rice, concept that's probably a bit abhorrent to most Westerners, but a notion that the living and the dead are integrated in some way, and that there's a connectivity between life and death and what it is we do while we are alive. And so there are many great traditions that we should be open to in our search for the change, not only for the First Nations peoples, but for the change in our society, because to improve the First Nations people's lives, we've got to ultimately change the world in which we find ourselves being caught up in and living within. And that's a bigger challenge for many of us. And these great traditions, as I say, the Islamic traditions, the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, part of that Abrahamic tradition, is probably what I understand best. Not that I'm an expert in it by any means. But it's also what I referred to in the Yarra situation as the Bulgarigara. Before the world was formed, how was it brought into existence? In Christianity or any other thing, you talk about creation. You talk about how these stories, these dreamings, these songs, these ceremonies, how they created the traditions and even the topography, the local landscape, and the way people engaged and lived within that. If in the West we could get people to start to think about this question of connectivity at a far greater depth than just the aesthetic, that this is in fact an essential component for us as human beings. And we know that these cultural beliefs interface clearly with our moral and our political value systems. And that's where the challenge often arises for us, because it's hard for us to debunk or to distance ourselves from the formation or the culture out of which we've been socialised into, and to think in someone else's cultural reality. How do we think in terms of the First Nations peoples who's had to live under the tyranny of terra nullius, for instance? Yet that same concept has been the source of the validation of the tenure systems that most of us enjoy. The freehold we enjoy, the way in which we can aggregate our assets and develop wealth through private property. But the First Nations peoples have had to live under that tyranny until the Mabo judgment, of course, and then to continue that struggle with the legislative response and the concept of bucket loads of extinguishment that Mr Fisher and Mr Howard inculcated into the amendments of the Native Title Act. So we've got to put ourselves into a mind that I'll return to in a minute. And no doubt St Thomas More, because he's known as the man for all seasons. He said he was patron saint of, don't know why, of politicians, but of lawyers and statesmen I can understand, but of politicians, that's a bit more tricky. But obviously, not only could Sir Thomas More transcend the prejudices that he may have held himself, but also was courage. He had courage and faith in being able to stand against the authority of a king and to be fearless in what he believed should be the position that the king adopted. So, and of course, as you know, he paid the ultimate price for that commitment. His commitment to, some would say, the rule of law, but certainly to conscience. His commitment and fidelity to what I would say, his sense of lian, his sense of who he is, what he is, why he is, and why things should be in a better state of balance and resonance with other humans, with the institutions, and with whatever else humans he was confronted with at the time. I believe that one of the empathy points I have with Sir Thomas More, that he asked that his beard not be interfered with when they removed his head. There's a great deal of respect for his beard, in addition to many other things. But in his book, Utopia, he created a self-contained world, as it were. He was set upon an island in which communities shared a common culture and a common way of life. You know, Utopia is a wonderful place. And we dream of it. In the depth of our hearts, despite the differences of our faiths, we dream of a utopia, a world where poverty pain, suffering, violence, cruelty and all of those terrible things no longer exist. And that we behave towards each other, not only in a civil way, but in the true sense of being brothers and sisters, despite, again, our diversity and differences. So a utopia that in some senses may not be achievable within the limitations of us as human beings, but certainly may be achievable through our beliefs that we hold in faith in another world, or in an extension of this world, whatever it is we contemplate happens after we're laid to rest. But he was greatly, he imagined a society governed by these values of social inclusion and mutually agreed principles. Now they're worthwhile striving to achieve in trying to change a world that does not accord those to the First Nations peoples. A world where there's social inclusion, which we don't have, because you look at the incarceration rates, you look at the out of care home positions of First Nations kids, and we look at the poverty, and the budget tonight's a good example of how easy it is for well-disposed people in the Parliament to simply see that First Nations are really not a key and integral part that we should pay some attention to, as we might want to do to the other end of town. The thing that dawned on me when I was trying to get my head around this was the Christian narrative of Adam and Eve and the idyllic world of Eden, and that they enjoyed until they defied the prohibition that they weren't to eat, as the story says, a certain type of fruit from a certain kind of tree. So they rebelled against the will of their Creator. And I often think of this, that the idyllic world was not just Adam and Eve, but we often forget of the creation that existed in unity with those people as well. So the connection between humans and the environment is absolutely integral to any kind of salvation. So how we treat the environment has a direct nexus to our salvation as human beings. It's not just how we treat ourselves as human beings. We've simply got to find what it is about our faith that enables us to enjoy our creation without destroying it. So that obviously led to the Christian narrative of the necessity for the Creator, God, to become incarnate and to suffer and die as a way of reaffirming, in the Christian tradition, the love of God for his people, but also for the message that you are saved. However, you're not relieved of your human gifts to grapple with the challenges of the day-to-day uncertainties and matters that are unclear and that are challenging, like a new relationship with the First Nations peoples. How do we contemplate this? How do we go about it? Well, the Uluru Statement, after a series of dialogues, has said that they want something like a Makarrata, a commission that sets itself up, that's set up by the government, to deal with truth-telling and to deal with agreement-making. You would have thought, well, that's not a bad thing. After 200 years, we might get around to a bit of truth and we might start to figure out how to get some agreements. Because we have been working on agreements as a consequence of the Native Title Act, so it's not totally an alien concept. But it's when we come to the sort of seminal issues of how did people from Britain take possession without the consent of the First Nations peoples, is when we start to back off. because that then starts to threaten what it is we have adhered to and have attached ourselves to and have held strong convictions about, and possibly for good reason. 200 years of being told terra nullius was the basis upon which you had good tenure. It's not a bad basis for believing that. But then to be told by a High Court, well, no, sorry, that was a legal fiction, it was a lie. And that's not how this nation was actually, what the state of it was when the British came. It was occupied in the custody of First Nations peoples. So this, reverting back to the Garden of Eden, this question of the disobedience and the fracturing of that connectedness, we've got to deal with the fractured nature of our societies. And I'm not just talking about people who are on the poverty scale and some are on the rich scale. That as humans, there's a fracturing of humanity, and there are forces that exploit that fracturing and fan it. If we look at, our appalling policies on people in detention camps in Manus Island and Nauru and places like that, how we treat these people and children. And the good people of Billawheeler, who was down in Melbourne the other day to plead with the minister to keep those people in Australia who have been settled at that place at Billawheeler and contributing to the community. So our challenge as people of faith is, how do we deal with this? The politicians aren't gods. Most of them are pretty ordinary, like me. They are political operators. They're expedient, efficient individuals who want to stay in power in the main, who want to create a society according to their own vision. That's true of all parties. So there's nothing salvific about them as essential to the destiny of humanity. But they are obviously tremendously critical to how a civil society can resolve and deal with challenges that are embedded in that society, like the First Nations peoples and their quest for justice in this nation, through agreement making, through entrenchment in the Constitution, through treaty making and agreement making. And to our credit, in some of our jurisdictions, this is starting to begin. In a small way. In Victoria, South Australia was going down this track until that government got thrown out. There were a few other governments starting to talk about it. The Northern Territory is beginning to talk to the land councils. So the notion of agreement, a new social contract, a new compact, a new setting of a relationship is possible. Because some people with courage, not necessarily in the same ilk as Sir Thomas More, but with courage, with some insight, with knowledge, and with commitment to changing the status quo position, are prepared to undertake that journey. Now they need support, they need to be encouraged, they need to be helped with the crassness of polls and all of those other things. Because politicians will ultimately shy away from the good if the polls are saying they should do something else. They misread that in the LGBTI debate, but it took them a while to get to that. But you can see how hard it is for the political component of our institutional lives is very reluctant to move beyond what it perceives to be the ethos, the values, the aspirations, the desires of those of us in the communities, in our societies. So people of faith have got the task of bringing some light into those sorts of debates, bringing some focus on the question of justice, liberation, peace and harmony around those matters. Because Otherwise, your faith becomes... I described it today in the budget as, as kids, as stolen generations, we were in this foster care, and the budget was a bit like the natural-born children receiving all the presents, and the foster kids were just picking up the wrappers. And we were able to play with that. And they were really waiting for the minister to come in and blow up the coloured balloons so they could cheer. So that was my take on the budget for First Nations today. So I'm not impressed. As to our capacity as a political institution to actually move in front of where faith communities might be, and how we might in fact achieve the justice that we might acknowledge deep in our hearts, but sometimes are fearful of how others might respond if we were to articulate it. So as human beings, we have to grapple. And one of the accounts in one of the Gospels, I've forgotten which now, but one of them is very much the Christology in it is very much a Christ figure that has to grapple with the options of the day-to-day slog. There's no blueprint, there's no magnificent highway to go down and then everything's going to be done. There's a tortuous path, and even at the end of it, you're not sure whether you're, as he said on the cross, whether you've been deserted by your own father for what it is you'd adhere to in the instructions of what he believed were what his father's wishes were. Now, that's one tradition. There may be other traditions of faith that have other ideas, but they require us to perform our duties in a manner that's meant to be respectful to the rule of law, but under the shadow often of peril. Not to the same degree of peril that Thomas More was faced with, because he got his head cut off. But there are places in the world where, as Justice Kirby said, I think in his address to this assembly, where people have very little regard for the rule of law, where to find the equivalence of someone like a Thomas More, we might need to look. And we'd have to go to other countries around the world where judges uphold universal values at the peril of their own careers, but also at the peril of their own lives. Human rights activists, people in many different theatres of our world standing for democracy or for principles of fairness and justice often disappear, and we repatriate people to places where they may disappear as well as a consequence of us stopping the boats. So, and we've got a movement in our political sphere to really restrict the capacity of your elected representatives not to have a part in oversighting those policies and practices of our security forces. So there are some challenges beyond just the First Nations peoples. There are challenges to us who live in a civil society and want to see the rule of law and the principles of democracy actually upheld and exercised on your behalf as representatives of your behalf, whomever they are, rather than being delegated to functionaries who have absolute control over the nature and destiny and purpose of issues that require far more humanity and ethical consideration, and not just political ones. Justice Kirby says that judges in Australia and New Zealand have their own challenges, including the failure of commentators and parliamentarians to understand the inescapable functions of a judge of our tradition. So, in our constitution, as you know, there's a separation of powers between the judiciary and the legislature. And that's a very healthy thing, thankfully. But there's some that do not understand that, even in the political domain. And it's always open to the Parliament, of course, to change things that the court does. And that's what happened with Mabo. The common law ruling, put into legislation, amended by a subsequent government, which is the capacity of the Parliament. Not necessarily with the consent of the First Nations people, but that's the democracy within which we live. And that's the democracy within which the First Nations peoples live. And around which people of faith seek to impact and influence. And periodically I get some very, very wonderful people coming to see me from out of the faith communities with concerns over global issues or global tensions. And again, it raises for me, well, what is the convenience with which we every morning say the Lord's Prayer in the Parliament? And it means nothing after that prayer's finished, it seems to me. And we don't say any other thing for the other faiths and religions that are part of our complex multicultural society these days. You ring the bell if you want me to stop, because I might just continue on and be a bore. But I'd rather you ask me questions, absolutely. I mentioned Mabo, and I'm not going to go back to that and dwell on it, but it was a seminal moment for us to do something different, and we didn't. And there are many of those seminal moments in our lives. The Bringing Them Home report of the late Sir Ron Wilson and Mick Dodson and others. Another occasion, it took years for an apology to be given, and we still haven't come up with a compensatory regime, and we're still dealing with the intergenerational trauma of those peoples. And we are creating a new set through this out-of-home care systems that our jurisdictions are, some 17,000 kids in out-of-home care these days, under our noses. And there are proposals that the longer they stay in out-of-home care, there should be a system, no reference to the First Nations people, but a system adopted for an adoption, a permanent adoption of these kids. Now, we can't sit blindly and say, well, that's a good thing. Certainly First Nations people don't sit blindly, but as people of faith, we have to understand we've gone through some of these journeys and we've had some of this truth reflected back to us. And our job is to grow. That's one thing we can do. We can grow our understanding, and we can rearrange our prejudices on the basis of better information and better truth being told to us. It seems to me that the legacy of Thomas More is very much about being confronted with a circumstance, or set of circumstances, not knowing really. Fine, he was a man of faith and he had all of those attributes. But when you're actually confronted by the moment of what it is you want to do and how it is you're going to do it, that becomes the moment of truth for each and every one of us. And that will be the sort of data bank upon which we'll be assessed ultimately at the pearly gates or at some other transitional point from this world to the next, if you believe in such a thing. Otherwise we'll just go back to being part of the earth or have our ashes scattered and hope that our contribution as a human being has meant something for the enlightenment and the happiness and peace of others. So I won't speak more of Mabo and I won't speak more of the Makarrata and the need for some conclusion really to the way in which we've travelled as First Nations peoples and non-First Nations. The 67 referendum we all take pride in, because, you know, the vast majority, overwhelming majority of Australians came to the view that we needed to do something. They were appalled at the living conditions. They were appalled at the way people were treated. They were appalled at the circumstances that fellow Australians who happened to be First Nations peoples found themselves in. And they changed the Constitution, and it's been the most successful referendum we've ever had. I believe that the Australian people are far more enlightened than the prejudice of the politicians that I've got to deal with at different times over this matter. Otherwise I'd stay home and Broome and go fishing and enjoy my life at the age of 70. But this is something that we can do. We can't put this off. We can't put off the recognition of the First Nations peoples, or we can't put off the resolution by way of treaty or agreement with the First Nations peoples, either at local levels, state levels or national levels. We can't put those things off and pretend that it'll go away, because it's not going to go away. We'll be far better as human beings and as Australians the day we're going to say, well, we want this battle taken on. We want our leaders in the political space to actually gear up, overcome their prejudices, gear up and start to look at how to go forward, as opposed to how to be so assimilationist and say, you're just the same as me. No, sorry, comrade, I'm not just the same as you. I have a different narrative, a different history, and a different set of experiences as to how I have lived my life within the polity of this nation, and how rights and interests have been denied, not only to me, but to others before me, and continuously being denied to people who are coming behind me. So we have to find that. It doesn't mean someone gets something more than anyone else. If again we go back to the Garden of Eden, if that story has merit, truth, idyllic world, two humans, or one human initially, then one created from the rib of the man to be his partner, and then for them as a unity with creation to enjoy that, then surely these are things that are bigger than us. We'd love to think we control and manage the universe. We love to think we are in charge of this planet. We love to think we can keep discovering all sorts of things to make life better, and we do that. We do some of that. That's fine. But at the end of the day, we live in a finite world. Resources are finite. If we keep polluting the place, oxygen will become finite, and we'll all expire. Not to be dramatic about it. But unless we are smart and intelligent as to how we deal with not just climate change is one concept, but the connectivity of humanity, not only within itself and to itself, but its connectivity to creation. And how does the two components celebrate the unity that can give the peace, the harmony, and the sense of well-being that we need for our own faiths, but for the faiths of others as well. So, my friends, I will stop there. There are other things I've written down, and there are other things I've said tonight that are not written down. So, we'll take it as that, and I really will be at your hands to respond to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Dodson, for that fascinating address. So let's go to questions. We have our team members around. We have some written questions coming forward. One up the front, Cole. Just while we're waiting, it was remiss of me not to recognise the presence of the Honourable Warren Snowden, the member for Lingari. Also, Monsignor John Woods came in. So perhaps we'll give those two gentlemen a welcome. Okay, Michael Flynn from Downer. Senator, if Labor wins the next federal election, is a shortened cabinet likely to implement the Uluru Statement soon?
Absolutely. I think Bill Shorten's made it clear that he's up for the discussion around treaty. He certainly has made it clear that he's that we would look towards legislating an entity in the first instance, obviously in negotiations with the First Nations peoples, to negotiate an entity, then to look towards the entrenchment of a voice, whatever it's called, an entity, into the Constitution. We'd also then look again, subject to consultations with First Nations peoples, the setting up and the legislating of a Makarrata Commission. But we'd work in collaboration with the states, who, as I said, are doing some good work in some places, and build on what's in existence and be guided a fair bit by the leadership from First Nations peoples. But we're not diametrically opposed, as the current government seems to be, to those propositions.
Thank you. Michael has a follow-up question. How can Prime Minister Turnbull know voters will support the coalition if he changes his mind on the Uluru Statement?
My crystal ball doesn't go that far. Look, the Prime Minister obviously is a good man in many different ways, but he's terribly spooked. He's terribly spooked. I've known him when I was out of politics and when he was part of the Republican movement and all of those things. His experience with the failure of the Republican referendum has scarred him for life, that I think he's incapable now of contemplating anything that might appear to be quite radical. And of course he's got some people that reinforces that view around him. I don't know, I'm not a member of his faith group. I don't have to preach to him, but if I was, I'd be trying to liberate his soul.
Thank you. Christopher Evans from Reed asks this question. You spoke of creating a new social contract across the country. What role does education play in building this contract?
It plays a very key fundamental role. Obviously, education, and again, I would think education around the values, the international values and standards that have come from the United Nations declarations on different things would be a good part of the educational system that we need to build in far more, not in deference to tenets of faith and belief that people have got, but I do think education is going to help us deal with the complexity of a rapidly changing world where diversity and difference has to be accommodated. You don't have the catch-up time. And the standards around which others ought to be able to enjoy quality of life, we've got to find some common ground, and that's primarily those international declarations on the rights of people and others. But I think human rights education is really, really part of things. History, obviously the complexity of the history, the narratives of that history, of how people came and took over and other people were subjugated to things, but the history of why we need to now remedy that situation, not just to dwell on the past, but to say this is an important component to where we're going to go as a unified, integrated society with the best respect for the diversity and differences of our values.
Thank you. Peter Nolan from Chisholm, he refers to the treaty, the Makarrata, the constitutional recognition. How will these developments help with issues such as incarceration rates and longevity?
Well, if you're able to get the jurisdictions, because incarceration goes to the criminal justice systems of each of the states and territories primarily, so those, if you had agreements negotiated with First Nations, either at a regional, local level with local command police, with a statewide agreement or a regional agreement, over the protocols that ought to apply for someone who's in fine default, for instance. Because a lot of people end up in custody because they haven't paid a fine, a simple thing. A lot of women they're in custody because of domestic, and they're doubled up because they've got domestic violence and they've had some other response to that, and so they're in custody. So the social circumstances are not readily understood by our police forcing, and that's not a criticism of, but they just come from another culture and another society. And unless there's a nexus, a meeting, and an agreement and a protocol is put forward as to how they ought to interact and mutually collaborate for the benefit of victims as well as perpetrators of crime, we'll go nowhere. We'll just see a continuing rate of incarceration. But that's a big struggle, and there are positive things like the justice reinvestment matters. There's work that's been going on at Burke, for instance, with the community, the police, the various sectors. Philanthropic groups are supporting, a lot of that, trying to reduce the recidivism rate of young people out there. More that needs to happen. The Koori Court up at in Sydney, gets under pressure because of the budget, but it does marvellous work in trying to keep young people out of custody and get them rehabilitated and reorientated into their own, carrying their own responsibilities in a society. So there's some real positive things that we are doing. We have to build on them. We've got to give them greater emphasis and greater demand, that we just don't keep filling up jails, that we find alternatives and diversionary practices that keeps people out of that. And part of that, of course, is addressing, as I said at the start, those social factors like housing, health, education. Those things have got to be addressed as well.
Thank you. Jackie McLaughlin from Queanbeyan asks, considering our current political climate, do you believe or have faith that there is a way forward for the First Nations people, and what will that future look like?
Well, after the budget today, I'm a bit down, but look, I think there will be this joint select committee that Warren Snowden and I both sit on, and I co-chair with Julian Lesser from the other side. It offers us an opportunity. It's not the best thing that the First Nations peoples may have wanted, but it's still the debate and the concepts that have come from Uluru and that have been around from the various reports on constitutional recognition has kept that alive. I think that it probably won't lead to a uniform report on constitutional entrenchment of a voice, but there is possibilities, I think, of finding some common ground around a legislative response. Now, I don't want to preempt what the committee's going to do, but I do think there are some good people on the other side who know that, and tonight's budget is a classic disaster, where the need for a voice to the Parliament would have helped that budget improve. And that's after a long lot of consultations that have taken place with First Nations peoples.
This is from Robert Kennelly. In Australia, there is a lack of education in Indigenous history. It's a bit hard to read. Robert, can you add to that?
Well, I can try and ask it. I'm Robert Kennelly from Holy Trinity. It's my belief, Senator Dodson, that the problem with a lack of understanding and a lack of care for our Indigenous brothers and sisters is due to a lack of education. That is, a lack of white education about Indigenous language, Indigenous history, Indigenous spirituality, and just for the moment I've forgotten the fourth thing.
Well, you're probably right, but I think it's... The lesson of Thomas More is we have to be self-effacing. Yeah, in a sense. I don't know much about the Vietnamese society. I went there once and I had a good look around and I was very impressed. And I thought, why do we go to war with these people? They're just going to beat us anyway. But because they'd had a number of wars with other peoples, and we didn't understand their history of how they vehemently defended their lands against all sorts of oppressors. So we've got to understand who we are before we can start to delve into the diversities and intricacies of others. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but it's very hard to Like I mentioned 3 concepts tonight. Now I'd be interested to know whether any of them remembered any of those. Okay? Mabulia, you know, Mabuburu, Mabungarangu. 3 concepts in Yarra about well-being, community welfare or well-being and the land. Now, but the language is Yarra, but those concepts are universal for all of us. So how you not only get to understand the uniqueness of individuals and diverse cultures and peoples, but how do you see the correlation and the common ground between what you have in your culture and your society and a resonance with what those peoples have got as human beings. And if we can coalesce as human beings, despite the diversities of our cultures and society, values and structures, we find the common ground as humans, then I think the capacity to accord justice and peace and respect and honour to those of difference is something that we should have inculcated into us through our education system, rather than the intricacies of the concepts that I've raised with you tonight. You know, I'm not saying you should know that, but it'll unless you're a linguist, unless you spend time with Yarra people, you're probably not going to do it, and you're probably not going to have that opportunity in many ways. But I think there's far more in common as humans that we've got to find and then see the connectivity with other humans around. You know, the colour of skin isn't the division. It's what's in our minds and our prejudices that makes us different to each other, really.
Thank you. Monica Phelan asks, we live in the Western world where individualism is rife. How do we truly convey the concepts of importance of interconnectivity amongst humans and respect for creation?
Well, that's a big challenge. But you know, everything can't be just subjective. Everything just can't be about me. The degree of selfishness that we're capable of is paramount every day of the week. You know, the government's going to bring in a tax, a celebrity tax, because some want to have fame has got to trust that they're generating funds out of it. Well, pretty quaint idea, but you know, a celebrity tax, because some individual is trafficking in or trading in on their uniqueness and marketing themselves. This is the height of individualism. So, but when you come to individualism and living in a civil society, then the balance has got to be struck. And that's the challenge we have in a Western democracy, is how do we get the balance between individual aspirations and desires and differences with what's the common good. Now there are challenges in both of those things. As we saw with Thomas More, he was an individual, he had a belief, he pursued that belief to his detriment against the common good, or the state as it were. So the common good, for years in our society, as you know, and probably still is, a challenge for some of us to grapple with the changes that the Parliament's made to marriage laws, LGBTI communities. Big change, big challenge. But we've got to find a way for that individual kind of view and our common humanity in a civil society. Civil societies aren't about faith so much, they're about balances of competing individual aspirations and desires. And how do you organise that in a manner that produces the best for all, even of their diversity and difference amongst us? And that's a really challenging task, and that's why governments get voted out. why some other government gets voted in, or some other party, because they believe, you believe, as an elector, that this group has had their use-by date, this mob have got something better to offer that will bring a better society, a better quality of society, a greater level of tolerance, of security, all of those things that we want. And that's a good tension point between the voters and the parliaments.
Thank you, Senator Patrick Dodson. The Senator's been addressing us for an hour. I think we should call it to a conclusion, and we'd like to invite Father Joshua Scott to come forward and present a vote of thanks. Can we thank again the Senator? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator Dodson, for your kind words, but also for providing us with an insight into what issues our First Nation peoples face, but also on many ways we can address and look at them as well. It's always a very important issue for us to look at. I was saying to Pat before, I spent some time in the Kimberley, and you reminded me of something tonight that I'd forgotten. That's the courage of our people. Coming as a Wiradjuri man today, the perseverance of our people that we've had to face, and also the hope that they have for something better. When I was in a place called Balgo, little kids, this tall, running around, no shoes. They didn't want to go to school, so they threw a cinder block through the school bus window. The beautiful thing was that the elders smashed the rest of the window in. We got in and we drove around without a windscreen because we wanted to make sure our kids had a go. And it's through the courage that, like what we're hearing tonight, that our people really are happy to get in and to put the effort in for our First Nations people. So, Pat, thank you for standing up and being a St Thomas More for our Aboriginal people. Thank you for showing us and addressing different parts of the agenda for our First Nations people. And as a Wiradjuri, we'd say, here I'm going to try and speak Wiradjuri now, it's been a while. Mandan Guwu is thank you very much, my brother, thank you for everything. And if I can ask a favour, when I'm on Walkabout and Broome next, can I go fishing with you? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father Josh. We just have one final matter. I would like to invite Cole McMaster to come forward, who's our most recent parish pastoral chairman.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Senator Pat. Just a quick 1 minute, and Mark, don't go anywhere. Just a quick farewell. Mark Evans, come forward. It's always good to embarrass a young man in a forum. Mark is a very loyal member of our parish community to a very wonderful family, the Evans Landy family, Rosemary and David and their brother Chris. Chris teaches in one of the Catholic primary schools and is our sacramental coordinator for the parish. Mark's been our parish secretary for 2 years, more latterly with some assistance, and I'm not sure if a person in their mid-20s is going to have a sea change, but he's taken a change of direction in his life, and on the 30th of the month he is moving to Slovenia to undergo postgrad studies. And we would just like to take this opportunity, Mark, to thank you for your back-of-house support, not just in the parish, but especially to the forum. A lot of work transcribing speeches, looking after website issues, bookings, etc. And as a small little dedicated group, without, as you would all know, that back-of-house, it would just collapse. So Mark, Godspeed, God bless, bon voyage, and we look forward to hearing about Slovenia when you next return.
Thank you, Cole, and I heartily endorse Cole's comments I've greatly appreciated Mark's support. So look, we're closing now, but I'd just like to draw your attention to the next forum activity. It's our annual lecture and dinner. It'll be on Friday the 22nd of June. It'll be titled Lessons from St Thomas More and the Freedom of Religion in Australia Today. The speaker will be the Honourable Dan Tehan, the Federal Minister for Social Services. And then we'll have another forum on Tuesday the 30th of October back here in this hall. The dinner, I should say, is at the Mercure Hotel down the road. On Tuesday the 30th of October, Professor Greg Craven, the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, will speak. So that brings us to a close. We like to finish well before 9. We'd like to invite you all to stay for a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, a sandwich or whatever, and we greatly appreciate seeing you again shortly. I'd always thank the forum team for their work, and I always like to name them. Andrew and Monica Phelan, Cole McMaster and Elizabeth Kelly, Martin Dolan, Liz Hallett, Lindsay Rowe and Viv Arnold, Maria Mason, Estelle Smith, who's been supporting us for many years, and of course, as Cole said, the parish office team led by Sandy Cassidy and Mark Evans. And once again, we thank Father Bernie Patterson and Father Josh Scott, our parish priests, for their support for the forum.